She rolled her eyes when he entered the bank. To her, he was just another customer to mock, just another man she thought didn't belong. But she didn't see the pain behind his silence, the strength behind his chair, or the truth he carried with him. Every cruel word, every smirk, every insult cut deeper than she could ever imagine. Yet he said nothing. He waited, because what she didn't know, what she could never have guessed, was that the man she dismissed was far more powerful than she realized. And in just a few moments, her arrogance would shatter, replaced by a truth she couldn't escape. How does a single act of prejudice turn into the greatest mistake of her life? And what happens when the person you look down on is the one holding all the power? This is the story she never saw coming.
It was supposed to be just another ordinary day. For David, mornings always began the same. He wheeled himself across the quiet floor of his apartment, humming softly as the sunlight poured through the window. A man of quiet strength, David didn't ask for much. He loved his routines, he loved his independence, and above all, he loved proving every single day that his wheelchair didn't define him. He had built a life of quiet dignity. Friends described him as thoughtful, hardworking, the kind of person who never raised his voice, even when the world gave him every reason to. And on this particular afternoon, he was heading to the bank, a simple errand he had done countless times before. Just deposit a check, greet a few familiar faces, and return home. Nothing unusual, nothing out of the ordinary. But as David rolled through the busy sidewalks, there was a strange weight in the air. People bustled past, caught up in their own lives, while he moved steadily forward, unnoticed. That was something he had grown used to, being overlooked, underestimated, even dismissed. Still, David carried himself with quiet pride, his sharp eyes observing more than most realized. Inside, though, he often thought about the invisible battles he fought. Every stare that lingered too long, every whispered word he wasn't meant to hear, every smirk or laugh that cut deeper than the person giving it would ever understand. He had learned to mask the hurt, to push it down, to keep moving. But on this day, something would happen that even David couldn't prepare for. The bank doors slid open with a soft hum, and he felt the cool rush of air conditioning against his skin. He straightened his shoulders, adjusting his tie, a small habit that reminded him he belonged anywhere he chose to be. His mind was on the simple task ahead, but the universe had already set the stage for a moment that would test not just his patience, but his very dignity. Behind the counter stood a teller, someone who carried her own assumptions, her own prejudices, hidden behind a professional smile that barely masked what she truly thought. She didn't know David. She didn't know his story, his journey, or the truth of who he really was. To her, he was just another face in the crowd, another man she thought she could look down on. And while David wheeled forward with quiet determination, the air shifted. A glance became a smirk became a whisper, and soon the stage was set for words that would sting, for actions that would wound. But David didn't flinch. He didn't react, because deep down he knew something she didn't. This wasn't just another bank visit. This was the day a mask would fall and a truth would come to light. The kind of truth that changes everything. David rolled his chair forward, the soft hum of its wheels echoing faintly against the polished marble floors of the bank. He carried a quiet confidence, the kind born from years of perseverance. But today, that confidence was about to be tested in ways he never imagined. The teller, her nameplate reading Ms. Collins, glanced up as he approached. For a split second, her expression was neutral. Then, her lips curled ever so slightly, the kind of smirk that told him she had already made a judgment. "Next," she called, her voice sharp clipped, almost mocking in its efficiency. David placed his envelope on the counter. "Good afternoon," he said politely. She didn't answer. Instead, she eyed his wheelchair, then the envelope, then him again. Her brow arched as though his very presence amused her. "Do you even have an account here?" she asked, loud enough for the people behind him to hear. The question wasn't about banking. It was about belonging. David's jaw tightened. "Yes, I do." A chuckle escaped her lips, and she leaned slightly toward him. "Well, I guess they let anyone in these days." The words cut like glass. Behind him, someone shifted uncomfortably. A mother pulled her child closer. An older man cleared his throat but said nothing. The silence was its own kind of violence. Everyone heard. No one spoke. David took a slow breath. He had been here before, not in this exact bank, not with his exact person, but in countless little moments where the weight of prejudice pressed down on him like an invisible hand. He could lash out. He could raise his voice. But he knew how quickly the world turned against men who looked like him, especially men who couldn't walk away. He said, "Please deposit this," sliding the envelope forward. Miss Collins glanced at it, then back at him. She said, "You're not signing the back properly. Do you even know how this works?" His hands tightened on the armrests of his chair. His signature was neat, precise. He had been signing checks for years. This wasn't about paperwork. This was about power. A young man in line whispered, "Man, that's not right." But his voice died quickly when Miss Collins snapped her head toward him, glare sharp enough to silence. The humiliation continued. She held the check between two fingers like it was contaminated. She muttered, "This looks fake. Maybe I should call someone to verify. We can't just take anyone's word." Her emphasis on anyone's made David's stomach churn. He could feel the heat of dozens of eyes on him now. He wasn't just a man at the bank anymore. He was a spectacle. A scene unfolding before strangers who didn't know his name, his story, or his truth. He kept his voice steady. "The funds are legitimate. Please, just deposit it." She smirked again, tapping her nails against the glass partition. "Oh, don't get upset. I'm just doing my job." But this wasn't a job. This was a performance, a show of superiority, and she was enjoying every second of it.
The tension rose when she picked up the phone. "Security, can you come to my station?" Gasps rippled through the line. A woman whispered, "He hasn't done anything." But again, silence prevailed. Fear kept people still. David's chest tightened. Security? For what? For existing? For daring to sit at the same counter as everyone else? Within minutes, a tall guard appeared, his hand resting casually on the baton at his belt. His eyes darted to David, scanning him the way one might scan a threat. "This man is trying to deposit a suspicious check," Miss Collins declared, her voice full of false authority. The guard frowned. "Sir, I'll need to see some ID." David pulled out his wallet slowly, deliberately, as though any sudden move might be mistaken for something dangerous. He handed over his license, his hand trembling ever so slightly. The guard studied it, then the check, then David. "Looks fine to me," he said finally. Miss Collins's smile faltered. "Well, you can't be too careful. You never know with people like—" She stopped short, but the implication hung heavy in the air. The silence grew unbearable. Every ear strained, every eye watched. David could feel his dignity being chipped away, piece by piece, in front of an audience too afraid to intervene. He wanted to scream, he wanted to shout, but he knew better. In moments like this, the wrong tone could turn the victim into the villain. So he swallowed the anger, burying it deep, even as it burned inside him. "Deposit the check," he said softly. The guard shifted uncomfortably, handing the ID back. "He's fine, just process it." But Miss Collins wasn't finished. She leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper, yet sharp enough to cut. "You don't belong here. People like you never do." David's heart pounded. For a moment he thought about leaving, about sparing himself further humiliation. But then he remembered, this was his bank, his account, his right. And walking away, no, rolling away, would mean giving her exactly what she wanted. So he stayed. Minutes stretched like hours as she typed slowly, deliberately, dragging out the process. Each keystroke felt like a hammer pounding against his chest. He glanced around. Some people looked away, pretending not to notice. Others stared with pity. A few shook their heads in silent disapproval, but no one stepped forward. When she finally slid the receipt across the counter, her smile was icy. "There you go," she said sweetly, as though nothing had happened. David took it, his hand steady despite the storm raging inside him. He nodded once, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Because while she thought she had won, while she thought she had put him in his place, Miss Collins had no idea who he really was. And that truth was about to change everything.
The receipt sat in David's hand like a piece of broken glass, sharp, painful, a reminder of what he had just endured. Miss Collins smirked as if she had won, as if she had carved her superiority into stone. Around them, the crowd tried to breathe again, the tension dissolving into whispers. Some shook their heads, others avoided his gaze entirely. The room wanted to move on, but David couldn't. For a moment, his chest tightened so hard it felt like his ribs might crack. Rage boiled in his veins. He wanted to slam his fists against the counter, to shout, to tell the entire bank who he really was. But then he heard the famous sound, the child who had watched from the line, whispering to her mother, "Why are they being so mean to him?" The words pierced him deeper than any insult. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every silent witness, every young pair of eyes learning how the world treated men like him. If he stayed silent, the lesson would be dangerous, that cruelty could go unchecked. The guard was still hovering nearby, his hand resting lazily on the baton as though expecting David to snap. The air carried an unspoken threat. One wrong move, and we'll make you pay. David inhaled sharply. Then he exhaled, steady and deliberate. His voice carried not just to Miss Collins, but to every corner of the bank. "Do you know who I am?" The question sliced through the hum of whispers. People froze. Miss Collins tilted her head, smirk widening. "Another customer with a bad attitude?" she shot back, her tone dripping with sarcasm. David's eyes locked onto hers, unwavering. "I am not just a customer." His voice grew stronger. "I am the majority shareholder of this bank." The room erupted. Gasps filled the air. The guard's eyes widened. A teller at the far end of the counter nearly dropped her stack of forms. But Miss Collins only laughed. "Yeah, right. And I'm the Queen of England." David reached into his bag. Slowly, carefully, he pulled out a leather folder. Inside was documentation, papers with his name printed boldly across the top. He held them up for everyone to see. "This is my bank. And you, Miss Collins, just showed the world who you really were." The silence that followed was suffocating. Miss Collins' smirk faltered, her face draining of color. That's not," she stammered, her voice cracking. "This must be some kind of—" But the guard stepped forward, his tone sharp. "She's lying, sir, if this is true." He trailed off, realization dawning. David's calm demeanor never wavered. "True? His voice rose, commanding. Every person here witnessed how she treated me. The insults, the humiliation, the abuse of power, all because she thought she could look down on me. Heads turned, eyes once averted now locked on Miss Collins. No one could deny it. The truth was undeniable, etched in every second that it passed. She opened her mouth, but no words came. The weight of dozens of stares crushed her. Her power had evaporated in an instant, replaced by something she could never escape: exposure. David's hand trembled, but his voice did not. You wanted to put me in my place, he said, each word striking like thunder, but you forgot. I built this place. I own it. And today, I will decide your place. The entire bank felt like it was holding its breath. Every customer leaned forward, caught between shock and awe, waiting for what would come next. For Miss Collins, the room spun. She had mocked him, dismissed him, called security on him, and now the floor beneath her feet had vanished. Mr. Williams, another teller began timidly, addressing David with sudden respect. We didn't know. That's the problem. No one bothers to know. You judge before you see. You assume before you ask. And people like her, he gestured at Miss Collins, turn this into a game of humiliation. A murmur spread through the crowd. Some nodded. Others whispered words of support. And Miss Collins, her hand shook as she clutched the edge of the counter for balance. The guard stepped back, uncertainty clouding his face. He had been ready to remove David only moments ago. Now he stood frozen, unsure whether to apologize or simply disappear. David inhaled sharply. Then he exhaled, steady and deliberate. Do you have any idea what it feels like, he said, his voice cracking under the weight of emotion, to be judged not for your mind, not for your character, but for the color of your skin, for the chair you sit in, to be treated as less every single day? No one answered. No one dared. The silence screamed louder than any response. This, he continued, holding up the receipt she had given him like a piece of evidence, is not just a deposit slip. It's proof. Proof of how far we still have to go. Proof of how easily cruelty hides behind a smile and a counter. Tears pricked the corners of his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. Instead, he locked eyes with Miss Collins one final time. And you thought you were mocking a powerless man, but today, the only powerless person in this room is you. The room trembled with the weight of his words. For the first time since the ordeal began, David felt the balance shift. The fear that sat heavy in his chest began to loosen, replaced by something stronger: resolve. Around him, phones lifted, customers recorded, capturing the scene, ensuring that this story would not be buried in silence. The truth was no longer his alone to carry. It was now visible to the world. Miss Collins' lips quivered. Her smirk was gone, her arrogance shattered. In its place stood raw fear. She had tried to strip David of his dignity. Instead, she had exposed her own cruelty. David's voice softened, but it carried more power than ever. This is bigger than me, bigger than you. This is about every man, woman, and child who has ever been told they don't belong, and it ends here, today. Gasps filled the air again, louder this time, like a wave crashing against the walls of the bank. And then, silence. Every person knew they had witnessed something more than a confrontation. This was history. This was truth revealed in its rawest form. Miss Collins' legs trembled. She took a step back, muttering, I didn't mean... But the words died in her throat. Excuses sounded hollow now, worthless against the crushing weight of the truth. David didn't move. He didn't need to. His stillness was power enough. The room buzzed with anticipation. What would he say next? Would he fire her on the spot? Would he call the police? Would he walk away, leaving her to drown in her own shame? Every option hung in the air like lightning, ready to strike. And then, with one steady breath, David delivered the line that would echo long after the moment ended. You thought you could take my dignity, he said, his voice steady and unbreakable. But dignity is not yours to give or take. It is mine.
And today, you lost yours forever." The words rang out, final and devastating. The crowd erupted, not in cheers, not in applause, but in a stunned silence that spoke louder than any noise could. And as the tension reached its breaking point, the screen of the story froze, David's steady gaze burning into the camera. The narrator's voice cut in. But what happened next was something no one in that bank would ever forget.
The silence inside the bank lingered long after David's words cut through the air. For a few seconds, it was as if time itself had stopped. No movement, no whispers, just the weight of truth pressing down on every soul in the room. Miss Collins stood frozen, her once confident posture crumbling into a slouch of shame. The smirk that had fueled her cruelty was gone. Her face, pale and trembling, revealed the fear of someone who had just watched her own power collapse before her eyes. David didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice in triumph. He simply sat there, steady, calm, dignified. In that moment, his presence alone spoke louder than any outburst ever could. The manager emerged from his office, eyes darting between the stunned crowd and the man in the wheelchair who had just claimed his rightful place. He had heard the commotion, but by the time he arrived, the story had already unfolded without him. His gaze settled on David, recognition dawning as he pieced together the truth. "Mr. Williams," the manager stammered, "I had no idea you were visiting today." David's expression didn't change. "That's the point," he replied quietly. No one had any idea. No one cared to look. The manager turned sharply toward Miss Collins, whose hands now shook visibly. "This behavior is unacceptable. Effective immediately." David raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "No," he said firmly. "This isn't just about one teller. Firing her won't erase what happened here. The lesson must go deeper." The crowd shifted uneasily. Some nodded, others lowered their eyes, unwilling to meet his gaze. The truth had landed, heavy and undeniable. This was more than one person's prejudice. This was a mirror held up to society itself. David left the bank that day with more than a deposit slip. He left carrying the weight of every stare, every smirk, every silence. But he also left with a renewed fire in his heart. Because what had happened wasn't just his story. It was a reflection of millions. The child who had whispered to her mother would remember the day she saw injustice called out for what it was. The customers who had stayed silent would carry the guilt of their inaction. And Miss Collins would live with the memory of her downfall, a reminder that cruelty has consequences. For David, the impact was different. He had been humiliated, yes, but he had also reclaimed his power in a way that silence could never allow. He had shown the world that dignity does not crumble under insults, that worth is not decided by prejudice. Still, the scars lingered. That moment, like so many before it, would never fully leave him. The sting of being questioned, dismissed, mocked in front of strangers was a reminder of how fragile dignity can feel when the world is determined to strip it away. But this story isn't just David's. It belongs to every person who has ever been underestimated, to every voice that has been silenced, to every soul who has been judged not by their character, but by the color of their skin, the chair they sit in, the accent in their voice, or the name they carry. Because racism doesn't always shout. Sometimes it smirks. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it hides behind professionalism, behind policy, behind just doing my job. But make no mistake, its impact cuts just as deep. And if a man like David, who owned the very bank he walked into, could be treated this way, then what about those who don't have power? What about those who can't reveal a title or wealth or documents to prove their worth? That's the chilling truth. For every story like David's that ends in revelation, there are countless more that end in silence. The impact of that day rippled outward. Customers left with heavy hearts, replaying the scene in their minds. Some promised themselves they would speak up next time. Others wrestled with shame for saying nothing. But the question remained, why does there need to be a next time at all? How many more men and women have to carry the scars of prejudice before society learns? How many children must watch injustice unfold before they believe it's normal? How many silent bystanders will it take before silence is no longer an option? David went home that night, his heart heavy, but his spirit unbroken. He sat by his window as the city lights flickered to life, replaying every detail in his mind. The smirk, the whispers, the fear in Miss Collins' eyes when the truth surfaced. And then he thought about something larger, something that went beyond him. This was not just his burden, it was a collective burden. And it would only change when people stopped pretending it wasn't there. The truth is, stories like David's aren't rare. They're everywhere. In banks, in schools, in workplaces, in neighborhoods. Racism weaves itself into the fabric of daily life, often disguised as jokes, assumptions, or mistakes. But every cut, every slight, every humiliation leaves a mark. And the marks add up. So the question isn't just, what happened to David? The real question is, what will we do with his story? Will we let it fade into another viral moment, a clip shared and forgotten? Or will we carry it forward, using it as a mirror to confront our own silences, our own biases, our own complicity? Because silence, too, is a choice. David's story reminds us of something powerful. Dignity is not given by others. It is not validated by approval or acceptance. It exists within us, unshakable, even when the world tries to strip it away. But justice is collective. It requires more than endurance. It requires action. It requires voices that speak when silence is easier. It requires courage to confront prejudice not just when it's obvious, but when it's subtle, when it hides behind smiles and policy. And perhaps most importantly, it requires reflection. Each of us has to ask, have I been Miss Collins? Have I been the silent customer in line? Have I been the child watching, learning what adults allow? If the answer is yes, then the story isn't over. It's still being written, and we hold the pen. As the screen fades, David's steady voice lingers. This wasn't just my story, it's our story. And until we face it together, it will keep repeating. The music swells, carrying the weight of his words. And then the final question, echoing into the silence. How many more times must this happen before we finally say enough?